Welcome to the World Nuclear Association Strategic eForum on Sustainable Finance. Thank you to our sponsors, Urenco. The moderator for today's event is the Director General of World Nuclear Association, Sama, Bilbao, and León.
Welcome, everybody, to World Nuclear Association Strategic eForum on Sustainable Finance. As the world societies and economies continue to endure the effects of the COVID-19 crisis, it is absolutely crucial that the planning accelerates for the post-pandemic recovery. With most governments aiming at economic recovery that preserves the ambition for affordable energy transition plans, any post-pandemic economic recovery plans and associated investments must align with long-term economic, social, and environmental objectives. And those may be, of course, the Paris Agreement goals or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So today, we will examine the financial conditions of success for cost-effective investment that will result in the biggest impacts in terms of achieving, at the same time, the decarbonization and the economic revitalization goals that most governments have set for themselves. In particular, we will be looking at what kind of measures are needed to ensure that nuclear energy can make the fullest contribution to all these goals. So for this, I am absolutely delighted to share the virtual stage with an esteemed panel of experts from all over the world. So let me start by introducing all of them. Nicoletta Batini is lead evaluator in the International Monetary Fund Independent Evaluations Office, and she's also an affiliate professor at the Scuola Studi Universitari e Perfezionamento Santa Ana in Pisa. So welcome, Nicoletta. We also will have Leonardo Mendes Cabral, who is the Director of Privatization at the BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank. BNDES is the main financing agent for development in Brazil and has played a fundamental role in stimulating the expansion of industry and infrastructure in the country. Morgan Després is the Director of Strategy at Banque and also serves as head of the Network for Greening the Financial System Secretariat. This is the NGFS. And this is a group of central banks and supervisors that shares best practices and contributes to the development of environment and climate risk management practices. We also have the pleasure to have today Philippe Knoche, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Orano. Orano is a major player in nuclear fuel cycle products and services, logistics, and engineering. And of course, Mr. Knoche is also the chairman of World Nuclear Association. And last, but of course not least, we have Stephen Vaughan, who is the Vice Chair of Energy and Power at Rothschild and Company. He advises leading power companies on the energy transition strategy and products. And he's currently advising Sizewell C on their new build project. So thank you, all of you, for being here. I am very much looking forward to our roundtable. So, without much further ado, I'm going to start with my first question. I will start with Nicoletta. You have been working on a working paper from the International Monetary Fund that is expected to be published very, very soon. And the working title is Building Back Better, How Big Are Green Spending Multipliers? So this paper, I understand that has used data from many energy agencies, including ours, and looks at investment in clean energy and biodiversity conservation to help inform stimulus measures for a post-COVID-19 sustainable recovery. So, of course, we realize that working papers do not necessarily represent the views of the IMF or its board, But on the other hand, this study seems to focus on an economic angle that is important for climate mitigation, and its research findings may be quite important at a very wide level. So if you don't mind, Nicoletta, can you tell us what are the most important preliminary findings in the paper, in particular in relation to green energy sources?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Dr. Bilbao León. It's great to be here. Yes, we were interested in understanding if there is really a trade-off between the green and strong aspects of the recovery that we have ahead of us. And so in the past, there's been confusion about this topic. Some people thought that if you go green, you sacrifice, economic growth, you sacrifice jobs. And so we wanted to explore this question, and we prepared a working paper, which is coming out tomorrow afternoon on the IMF website. And yes, there is a disclaimer, a couple of us work at the IMF, but of course, this is the topic more generally of climate change and transition, which is very much at the heart now of the IMF agenda. And so to do so, we estimated Keynesian multipliers to measure the economic impact of spending on activities that will make economies greener, like investment in clean energy. This includes solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, biomass, and nuclear. And also we look at biodiversity conservation spending. Now, the Keynesian multiplier is one of the fundamental concepts in macroeconomics. It basically calculates the ripple effect of government spending onto the rest of the economy. When there is a slump, like now, Keynes theorized that boosting the incomes of those who receive government contracts and benefit payments helps them go on to spend and invest more, and these can in turn reverse the economic decline of a country. So we're interested, just at this time when a lot of money has been spent and thrown at stopping the pandemic, supporting lives and livelihoods, we have, scarce resources. We want to put them where, they're most effective at making economies stand back on their feet. And as the COVID crisis comes amidst a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, ideally, one would also like to focus this same spending onto green transitions. So we compare, we don't just compute green multipliers, we actually compare them to non-eco-friendly multipliers, or multipliers obtained from spending on things like fossil fuel energy generation or subsidies to unsustainable land uses. For example, public spending to support highly mechanized and chemicals-intensive industrial crop and animal farming methods. And now, using a new international data set, part of which was especially assembled for this study, and to which we're very thankful to the World Nuclear Association and other agencies like the OECD, NEA, the IAEA, and the IEA. Well, the study finds that every dollar that we spent in the past on key carbon neutral or carbon sink activities, from zero emission power plants, for example, nuclear plants, to the protection of wildlife and ecosystems, can generate more than $1 worth of economic activity. Now, this means that if you spend on these activities, you're creating debt, but that debt is going to pay back itself. So it's not weighing on debt. And crucially, the estimated multipliers associated with green spending are about 2 to 7 times larger than those associated with non-eco-friendly expenditure, depending on sectors, technologies, and horizons, in line with all the impact studies at the sectoral level. Among green energy multipliers, nuclear displays the strongest multipliers by far, especially on impact and the first year. Then the multiplier loses significance. So these are our core results, and they're basically driven by 3 factors that we elaborate in the paper that you can download tomorrow. First, green activities are more labor intensive than non-eco-friendly activities because they use far more of their overall investment budget for hiring people and relatively less on acquiring land, machines and supplies, or energy itself to run the power plants. The second, green activity imply usually a higher domestic content. For example, clean energy spendings, including, for example, nuclear, relies more on local labor, and there's big ripple effects locally. And third, green investments tend to produce far more jobs at all pay levels. And there are sectoral studies on nuclear that show, for example, that nuclear tends to pay higher wages at all levels than, for example, other activities, including within some of the renewables. So we conclude that greening our economies is not just smart for the planet. Most likely, it is also the shortest and cheapest route back to a prosperous global economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta. That sounds like a very, very interesting paper. We are very much looking forward to being able to download it tomorrow. So let me turn now to Morgan Desprez. So the Network for the Greening of the Financial System has stated that the adoption of sustainable and responsible investment practices by central banks is very important for better managing environmental, social, and governance risk and addressing financial risk associated with climate change. So in this context, the NGFS has developed several climate scenarios to provide a common starting point for analyzing climate risks to the economy and the financial system. And of course, both nuclear energy and renewables are included in those scenarios and in fact have a very important role. In particular, nuclear energy has a particularly significant role in what you call the orderly scenarios, where overall there is a lower economic impact from both the transition and the physical risks. So in your opinion of the NGFS, what are the consequences from a policy point of view from the results of all these scenarios that you have studied?
Thank you, Sema. Thank you for having me. Yes, as you rightly mentioned, one of the biggest deliverable of our network, the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, is, well, those reference scenarios, as we call them. Maybe I should explain a bit for those who do not necessarily know what it is about. The problem with climate risk, when you want to measure it, is that usually what people do, they take a snapshot of the current exposures using, some disclosure practices. But if you do that, it only gives you a backward-looking approach. You only know how the risk management practices have been involved, but it doesn't give you any forward-looking approach. You don't really know how the exposures are going to evolve over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And to do that, you need to build some specific scenarios, bringing together some financial information, financial data, financial hypothesis, macroeconomic analysis, but also non-financial data, non-financial analysis, which have to do with the climate science, with energy science. And it is quite complicated to do because it's not our job as central banks to develop those expertise. So we work closely with a consortium of scientists to build those scenarios. And maybe a last point I would like to make before I answer your question, Sama, those scenarios are not about predicting anything or forecasting anything. They represent some possible pathways to a low carbon transition. But we're not saying, the pathway is going to go this way or this way. We're just saying these are 3 or 4 possible pathways, and central banks and supervisors need to reflect or select the pathways they prefer, or the pathways which seem to be the more likely to them. But we're not saying this is going to be the correct and the right pathway to low carbon economy. So all in all, what do we expect from those scenarios? There are 2 things that we want to see. And in particular, this is something which has already been done in some countries. For example, in France, the banking supervisor is working on it. We want to see 2 things with those scenarios. First, what we want to know in a medium-term perspective is to know what the impact is going to be, to see to which extent banks and insurance companies' balance sheets are exposed to climate risk, to measure those exposures in a forward-looking approach. And for that, we use a medium-term approach. But also what we want to measure as well is how, in a dynamic manner, banks, insurance companies, and financial actors in general will change the allocation of their portfolio to hedge climate risk or to make it more aligned to a low carbon economy. So these are the two things we want to measure. And I'm not so sure we are now at a stage where we can take policy measures because, I mean, there are many things we still have to clarify. We need to continue to improve, upgrade our scenarios. We will be releasing in a few weeks from now an updated version of those scenarios. There are a number of things that we need to measure. We'll probably get back to that later. But for example, we have some definitions issues, taxonomy issues, data issues. But I mean, the ultimate objective at the end of the day is to use those scenarios so that authorities may say, this bank, this insurance company is particularly exposed to climate risk and is not taking the right measures to mitigate the risk. So we're going to do something about it. So it may be policy measures which will have to do with disclosure. And ultimately, later on, we may possibly imagine some measures which may have to do with capital requirement. But at this stage, it's still a pretty far and remote prospect. But ultimately, I suspect the objective is to take those scenario analyses on board and use them as a mainstream supervisory tool.
Thank you, Morgan. No, that's very. I mean, I think that is a great way to try to quantify this risk. So thank you for that clarification. So let me now turn to Stephen Vaughan. So Stephen, can you please tell us more about the role of governments in incentivizing and perhaps developing sustainable financing frameworks? And maybe more specifically, what does this mean on the availability and cost of finance for large projects such as, for example, Sizewell C?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sama. Thank you for having me on the panel. Yeah, look, I can answer your question, and it's quite helpful, I think, to set the concrete example of Sizewell C, which is, just by way of background, Sizewell C is a project under development in the UK. It's a twin EPR that will be a replica of the Hinkley Point C twin reactors being built currently down in the southwest of the UK. But unlike Hinkley Point C, which is primarily financed by EDF on balance sheet, with Sizewell C, the expectation is that EDF will not play a major role in financing. It'll take a small minority stake, but the ambition for Sizewell C is that we raise private finance. And that means a big quantum of capital. For Sizewell C, it looks like we'll raise probably in excess of £20 billion. And of course, that capital needs to be raised at low cost. We need the power output from Sizewell to be competitive. We're targeting a power price between £40, £60 per megawatt hour. And so to achieve that, to be able to raise that sort of quantum of capital at the sort of cost of capital, which can deliver an attractive electricity price, we need the deepest pools of capital to be available. And they need to be available at an efficient pricing. There's no question that we can afford to have any impediments. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that the taxonomy, so the formal ESG reference points, need to be positive. If we want the biggest institutions to come and play and commit, then the formal requirements obviously need to be fulfilled. But I think there is an additional point, and this is a more subtle one, that it's not just about taxonomy. There needs to be a broader context of political support that investors are going to believe is durable. So there needs to be a clear declaration, and there needs to be a clear political consensus that nuclear is essential to the country's net zero goals, to the climate ambition, and that really cannot be equivocal. So it's about ESG classification for more, but it's also about the reputational issues that investors will also consider. And it's true, as we've embarked on engagement with investors, that it's absolutely clear that climate change matters, and they consider the issues. Investors will consider the issues not just from the perspective of meeting regulatory requirements, but from a much broader set of stakeholder perspectives. So they are worried about what their ultimate investors think. They are worried about what their pensioners think, if it's a pension fund, or their savers. They're worried about what their employees think, and they're worried about what their customers think. And it's against that backdrop they need to see there being as I say, a clear consensus. These are going to be big, high-profile investments that big investors do not want to be controversial. They're expecting those investments in some cases to be deployed for decades, sometimes in quite illiquid positions. And so investors will extrapolate and ask themselves, well, is this going to be something which I'm having to defend and to justify? Of course, it must meet the relevant commercial criteria, but they need to know that it's going to be reputationally supportive. And I think that, as I say, clearly requires taxonomy to be in place and supportive, but it also needs there to be a wider consensus and a wider political declaration that the nuclear project is a fundamental part of society's objectives to hit the climate targets. And I think that's something that's already becoming evident, as I say, in our engagement with investors. And we need all channels to be on for this sort of investment to be capable of being raised and at the sort of pricing that we want.
Thank you, Stephen. Absolutely. You made a very clear point. Yes, the role of governments is going to be quite vital. So we will go to more detail about that. But let's now go a little bit to the other corner of the world, perhaps. So Leonardo, Mendes, Cabral, what is the BNDES approach for financing infrastructure and perhaps more specifically new nuclear energy projects in Brazil?
Thank you so much. A great pleasure to be here with you today. Well, as you mentioned in the beginning, BNDES is one of the largest providers of financing to infrastructure projects in general in Brazil. And we also played an important role in financing the nuclear energy here in Brazil. But as Stephen just mentioned, we are changing a little bit what we aim to do related to financing nuclear projects. What we learned from the past. As you know, we have Angra 3, which is a nuclear plant in Brazil that's under development. And the fact that it's been under development since the 80s. So they started the construction in the 80s with financing from BNDES and from local national banks. It stopped in the 80s. Then we started back in 2007 with financing. It stopped again in 2015. So what we realized is that the problem was not financing. The problem was having the right structure, the right project, and then offer this project to be financed by private players. And that's what we're doing right now. BNDES has been hired by the Brazilian government and by Eletrobras to develop this project in Brazil. We ended the first phase last year. It's a 1,400 megawatts of generation, a smaller number than Stephen just mentioned. We're talking about $3 to $4 billion US dollars of investment. And we believe that with the right structure put in place, and also with the government aligned with the investments of nuclear power plants in the longer term in Brazil, we'll be able to attract not only financiers, not only global and local banks to finance the project, but also engineering and construction companies. So right now we're in the process of hiring a advisor to work with us, engineering construction advisor to work with BNDES to redesign the whole project, understand what has been done so far and what needs to be invested going forward. And as soon as we have that, and expect to have that by the end of this year, we'll start to work with banks to provide the financing for the projects. We also expect to get it finalized by mid 2022. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that BNDES will still play a role, yes, we will, but not the same role that we played in the past. And quite frankly, we believe it failed, being the sole provider of financing. We need to work together with the private sector, and that's what we're doing. And we believe that with the right project, we'll be able to finally succeed in developing the nuclear energy in Brazil.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think that we have seen this also quite a bit, how it is very important to make sure that the risk is appropriately allocated to the different stakeholders in a project. So I think that your point of view is quite important. So let me now go back to Philippe, Knoche. Philippe, can you give us the point of view of the nuclear industry on sustainable financing policies? And maybe what would be the significance of these non-technology neutral ESG classifications, such as those that maybe exclude nuclear energy?
Yes, hello to everybody. And thank you for the question, because indeed we are facing a risk of non-technology neutral taxonomies or ESG classification being put forward. And it would be a total contradiction with the aim of citizens and governments and institutions to fight climate change. If we go to the experts of climate, IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, a vast majority of their scenarios to meet the Paris Agreement targets require all low carbon technology to be mobilized. Same thing with the International Energy Agency. And the panel was great. We just heard also major institutions like IMF and NGFS to really also need all low carbon, including nuclear, to meet the scenarios and meet the targets. So a clear answer is, and Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, put it this way: we can't afford the luxury of excluding one low carbon technology, be it nuclear or another, from our scenarios, because if we do, then we will fail. We will fail because finance is a major link, as was explained perfectly also by our panelists, between the vision, the ambition of meeting the Paris Agreement, and the projects in the energy industry, which is capital intensive. For fossil, renewables, or nuclear, all these projects need a lot of capital, and the link between the vision and the project is finance.
Yeah, very important point. Thank you, Philippe. So let me go back now to Nicoletta, and maybe going beyond decarbonization. So of course, in OECD economies, we have obviously prioritized decarbonization, and sometimes we appear to be ready to sacrifice a little bit our quality of life to some extent, just not 100%. But we want to transition to cleaner energy systems. But of course, when we look at less developed countries, for them, economic development is the priority. And of course, they will need abundant external investment and support in order to develop affordable energy, in order to catch up with us, with the more developed world. So Nicoletta, what do you think that is the answer to this dichotomy?
So my reaction is that it's natural for those concerned about the pace and the risks of global climate change to hope that somehow, developing nations or the poor of the world, let's put it that way, in a kind of crude sense, can be persuaded to forego the energy-rich lifestyles that wealthy nations and wealthy citizens have enjoyed so far. or that people in these countries are ready to pay extra for clean energy, even when dirty forms are cheaper and easier to get. But I think, such hopes are misplaced. And just as, the farmers and workers of North America and Europe did in the 19th and 20th century, the urbanizing middle classes of a lot of emerging countries and developing countries are now buying cars, refrigerators, water heaters, and air conditioners almost as soon as they can afford the gas and electricity bills. They're eating more meat and taking more long trips, and no one has the power, as a matter of fact, let alone the right to tell them not to. And so any bold plan for saving the climate that fails to meet a massive increase in energy demand during this century is very likely to fail. And this is not my opinion. I think it's the opinion of the IPCC and many others, global Earth champions. If average per capita energy demand rises to current US levels by the year 2100, we're looking at some very, very big numbers for the planet, given population demographic growth projections. And I think I saw in a BP annual report on primary energy use, which encompasses all commercially traded fuels and renewable resources, that one of these numbers that comes out is something like 18 trillion bahts. In 2016, that was roughly the power needed to keep human civilization humming around the clock. So this is really, we really need an energy miracle. And the outstanding size of these numbers is, I think, the main reason that a meaningful change in the global energy system is. So the power rating must be really high, or it must be adopted at an explosive rate, preferably both, or it will simply be too little, too late to make much difference to climate change. So in our paper, for example, we don't take a stand on which source is best suited to perform that miracle, but it seems clear to me that one should act aggressively, as was just said by Dr. Knoche, that to increase all what's tried and true and already operating to make sure that we can rapidly deliver as much clean energy as possible to satisfy this growing demand. And we know this from the IPCC, that this includes all clean sources, which means all clean, tested, and already operating renewable and non-renewable source of energies. And I think, however, I think I want to finish here on a good hope note that for developing countries, we've seen these kind of miracles happen, and they went from having no communication to jumping straight into mobile communication technology. And I think, so the solution is feasible if we can align the policy, finance, and technology stars that we have in front of us.
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree. I mean, we really need to be optimistic. I mean, it is possible to achieve this challenge, but we really need to also be realistic with the tools that we have. So let me go back to Morgan. Can you tell us how the central banks are going to support the stability of the overall financial system in order to steer the investments towards a transition to a low carbon economy?
Well, there are many things that we can do, and there are a number of things that we can't do. And here I'm starting with the usual reminder that central banks and supervisors are not the only game in town. And it is, of course, a prerequisite that policymakers make the right decisions, and in particular that they introduce carbon pricing or carbon tax. But this is, of course, let's take that for granted. And for the rest, central banks, what they do, what they try to do, they always try to act within their mandate. And it's very important for them to do so within their mandate, because many of them are independent from the political power. And if they're independent, it means that they have to remain within their mandate. Otherwise, they would overstep, and there would be a breach clearly here in terms of accountability vis-a-vis the political power. So the first question we ask ourselves before acting is always, are we acting within our mandate or not? And so within our mandates, there are a number of things that we can do. My feeling is that within the central banking and supervisory community, there is now a very wide consensus that climate risk is a risk in terms of financial stability. So within the financial stability mandate of central banks, there are many things that we can do. We can help measuring the risk. We can ask banks to report. We can do some scenario analysis campaign. Later on, we can move to introducing some regulatory measures in terms of disclosure, for example, to begin with. We can also do a specific monitoring of the financial system to measure whether the exposures are growing, where the risk is locating. So here, clearly, as I see it, in many central banks and supervisors now, we see that a lot is happening, and it's pretty much understood everywhere that we have to do something within our financial stability mandate. Beyond that, the big question is it also a risk in terms of price stability? And here, this is probably the new frontier in our community. A few years ago, if you had invited me, I would have never even pronounced the word monetary policy, because it was completely taboo to say that there would be any kind of relationship between climate change and price stability or monetary policy. Now, things are changing. A growing number of researchers, but also policy analysts, are finding out that in a hotter world with more extreme events, more frequent, then at the end of the day, you're going to have an impact on I would say, the money supply, on your inflation targets, on your monetary policy indicators. And ultimately, if you want to do your job properly, you need also to include those within your price stability mandate. And you need to start reflecting around ways to introduce that in your monetary policy framework as well. Early next week, the NGFS is going to release a report on that to explore how, in practice, central banks can reflect climate risk in their various policy, I would say, monetary policy instruments, collateral framework, purchase programs, repos. So you will see there are already quite a number of quite interesting proposals which will be tabled. So this is for the price stability. And beyond that, I mean, central banks sometimes have a pretty big portfolio aside from monetary policy. They may have a very large reserve portfolio as well. Some central banks have massive reserve portfolio to manage. And well, the best thing we could do is to practice what we preach and to walk the talk and say, if you are central banks, you're telling your banks that they have to take care of climate risk, measure it, mitigate it, then also you need to reflect that in your own investment practices. And to give you an example, this is what the Banque de France has been doing. Last year, we published a report where we disclosed our exposures to the what we call brown industries. And also what we decided to do this year is to go one step further and also start introducing some exclusion from coal investments. We do that on our non-monetary portfolio because Banque de France is within the euro system, and within the euro system, we don't have full control over the monetary policy portfolio. And for that reason, we wanted to introduce them on our non-monetary portfolio on which we have full control. So as I said, there are many things we can do on financial stability mandate, price stability mandate, non-monetary portfolio, just to walk the talk. And if all central banks were doing this, I suspect it would already be a very big leap forward. And this is what we're trying to promote within the NGFS.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very, very interesting. So let me now go to Leonardo. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about different type of instruments, financial instruments. So can you give us some details about the BNDES Green Bond Framework, and perhaps in particular, how could this framework be applied to nuclear energy projects?
Well, the first thing that I'd like to mention is that hearing what our panelists are saying, I believe that we are all quite aligned, listening to what Nicoletta mentioned, to what Morgan just mentioned. But talking specifically about BNDES, we issued our first green bonds back in 2017. Actually, BNDES was the first financial institution in Brazil to issue a green bond in the global markets. It was small, actually, talking about $1 billion. But at that time, it was solely focused. So it's quite narrow and focused on developing solar and wind plants in Brazil. We didn't have any nuclear projects back in 2017. We had several solar and wind projects in Brazil. So this $1 billion was basically to finance this industry in Brazil. In last year, actually, in 2020, we issued a second note. But in order to expedite the process, we used the same rules that we had back in 2017. So basically to finance solar and wind projects. But since then, we've been discussing here at the board level, is this the right way to go, or should we adapt our green framework? And actually, we decided that we should adapt. So instead of calling it only green framework, it's now an ESG framework. Of course, green will still represent a large portion of what we aim to finance. And from now on, it's not going to be solely focused on, in terms of energy, it's not going to be solely focused on solar and wind. So it's renewable energy in general. We'll include other areas, like specifically in Brazil, we still have a huge problem in terms of water and sanitation. So it's been included. In terms of social, it's not only green, but in terms of social, we invest in terms of gender equality, to health education, to finance small and medium-sized entities. So what I'm trying to say is that we'll have a broader mandate in terms of a ESG, and not only green, but ESG framework. And in this new framework, of course, nuclear can be part of it. As we expanded from solar and wind to renewable in general, we'll be able to also finance nuclear plants in Brazil. But what I'd also like to mention is that what you're not going to do, and it's also quite aligned with has just been mentioned by the other panelists. So no financing to fossil fuel, no financing to cattle farming if it has any impact in terms of environment. If it has impact, no financing. So we're quite aligned with what has just been said. And the great news is that I'm talking about BNDES, but we have a panel with virtually all of the development banks across the globe, and they all share the same view. So I believe it will be the agenda for all the development banks on a global basis.
Thank you. Yeah, that is very, very interesting. So let me now turn to Stephen to talk about another mechanism. So let's look specifically at the regulated asset base, the RAB model, because it looks also quite suitable for attractive private financing in the UK, but also perhaps in developing countries, in particularly for large infrastructure projects. So do you think it is suitable for attracting private finance also specifically for nuclear new build in developing countries, or are there other alternatives that you can envision?
Okay, Sama, well, look, I'll just make a comment and then come to the point about the developing markets. I'll make a qualification then, and then come to the alternatives. So, you know, I think as Leonardo mentioned, the issue is around attracting capital is to create the right structure that presents for investors, if you want to privately finance, that presents for investors a proposition which doesn't impose too much risk. So at Sizewell C, the key issue has been sharing the risk appropriately between consumers and investors. That's the essence of the RAB model. It's made slightly easier in the UK because Sizewell C, we're building a replica, or we're planning to build a replica of Hinkley Point C, so that the design is going to be substantially proven as we go from Hinkley to Sizewell, and the same teams that built Hinkley will be building Sizewell. So I think a key sort of starting point is that there is a perception and the logic why the risk is lower than has been seen in some of the sort of first of a kind situations that have created a difficult backdrop for the new nuclear programs. And obviously, we need to create an interesting investor profile if we're going to be able to get the big quanta of money. I mentioned the £20 billion for Sizewell, and at the right cost of capital. So it's really important that we can present a pretty clean proposition to investors. So you pose the question then about the developing markets. Look, I think in sort of summary terms, the key issue is the credit rating. If you're going to want to be able to raise the sort of sizable quanta of capital that are needed for a nuclear project, and you're going to be able to do that at an attractive cost that creates competitive electricity price, you're going to need a strong investment grade credit. And the essence of the RAB model, the platform for the credit rating is the consumer covenant. The issue of, is the power tariff of sufficient credit quality to support the borrowing of the project as an attractive, strong investment grade credit rating. So that I suppose would be the key question. Now, I mean, politically, I think it's important that there is a perception that you're imposing on customers an acceptable level of risk and not just dumping on customers every risk that can't be handled, and that it's really likely to be expensive for consumers. And I think here, we need to look at what's the outlook for the development of nuclear. Are we going to be stumbling along building first of a kind in new jurisdictions? Are we going to have a very limited build out program, or are we going to repeat the sort of experiences of the 1970s and 80s, where frankly there was a rollout of nuclear that was sufficiently frequent and a momentum that was sufficiently large that the constructors were able to get on top of the construction issues. The utilities were able to get on top of the construction issues, and nuclear was able to be delivered, capable of being delivered with relatively low risk at a good cost. And we're really only at the beginning of that process, I think, with, if you like, the resurgence of nuclear at the moment. And let's face it, if we're going to deploy nuclear in a way that meaningfully contributes to climate goals, that means these assets have got to be functioning by the 2040s and 2050s. Well, even a project like Sizewell has a 10-year gestation. It's going to only be producing in the early 2030s. So, really, I think there's a big question mark out there. Is nuclear going to go through an acceleration where it's going to be really meaningfully deployed during the late 2030s and early 40s? I think if it is, then the risk perception changes. If the risk perception changes, then you can be much more imaginative about models. I mean, if I answer your second question, which was about what are the alternatives, and again, I think this will change if there is a significant uptake. But if we sort of take a backward-looking basis to answer that question, then really the alternatives to RAB funding at the moment appear to be much more focused on government funding or government-sponsored funding, perhaps through state-controlled, state-owned utilities. The models that we have seen have very much centered on vendor-supported models. So we have EDF building Hinkley Point C on balance sheet. We've seen others such as KEPCO offering to put significant amounts of capital into projects. But more evidently are the non-OECD actors. So China and Russia, who of course have well-developed programs with momentum and who are able probably to assess the deployment risks of new nuclear construction more readily. Particularly the Russians in Central and Eastern Europe have been willing to offer much more interesting financing packages and more risk-bearing, risk-taking construction projects. And I think, as I say, that's going to have to change if we're going to have some OECD models to match that. So yes, I think RAB is an interesting step, and I think it can work in other jurisdictions, but I think we need the fair wind of a bigger momentum and a more widespread deployment, which I think are then going to drive greater acceptance of of the different constituencies to take risk, because objectively the construction cost risk will be diminished by practice, frankly.
Very good point. I agree that we really need to reach this positive circle where we can develop and deliver projects on time and on budget, and that of course will lower the risk and will increase the appetite for financing future projects. So I agree that is quite important. So maybe I want to ask Philippe about a slightly different dimension. So if we look at electricity market structures globally, and we see how these different markets may attract and allow financing of nuclear projects. So what are the examples of markets that are particularly problematic for nuclear investment? And maybe are there any good examples of markets that are particularly positive and would allow nuclear, and would be maybe something that we need to consider to be adopted more widely?
Yes, and somehow this question also is a wrap-up of some of the interventions that were before, because if we look, for example, at the US, markets that can be problematic are fully liberalized with no value for carbon. I mean, Nicoletta mentioned the importance of having a value for carbon emissions if you want to fight climate change, because at the end of the day, if you want to be technology neutral, be it in terms of a tax, of a production tax credit or whatever, you need somehow to balance between all technology that are low carbon in a neutral way. So certainly markets where you have no value for carbon are already kind of just difficult to approach. And then Stephen mentioned that you also need, even if you're market oriented, political multi-partisan visibility. If you fear instability, it will be difficult to develop and be present over the long term. And this is both true politically and also in terms of regulators, as Morgan and Leonardo mentioned, that the regulation, not everything is political, or sometimes somehow politics translate into regulations, and you need these regulations also to be predictable and visible. We are embarking on a journey. John Kerry calls it a war for climate, and we really need everybody to be aligned. And the good thing with complex systems, because energy systems are complex systems, is that once everybody is aligned, they are so powerful. When there is coherence, it's so powerful. So what really is problematic is when there is incoherence between the ambition to fight climate change and either the regulations or the value of carbon, or then ultimately what Stephen mentioned on the way you allocate risks and money and investment via regulated asset-based or direct investment, that also fits into this. So it's really a sophisticated system that can be really powerful once you align all this. And this is frankly very, very positive to hear all the examples that have been given already today, to show that the system is getting aligned pretty much.
Very good. So if you don't mind, now I have maybe a couple of questions that I'm going to somewhat open to all of you in the round table, and maybe we can have a conversation. So the first question perhaps is more suited for perhaps Leonardo or Morgan, but obviously anybody is welcome to pitch in. So because both of you mentioned about these green rules, green classifications. So I think it's very important that we have seen several countries and even regions in the world that are moving forward towards the creation of taxonomies or classifications that are defining which economic activities are sustainable and which ones aren't. and it's not always clear how those taxonomies are developed. So maybe the question for you is, so number one, to which extent do you think that these classifications are going to influence the financial markets? Number one. And then the other thing that I think is also quite relevant is, how important is it for these classifications to be transparent and consistent in order for different decisions that are being made globally to also achieve the goals that we are trying to achieve? So I don't know which one of you want to jump in first. Maybe Morgan, I see you jumping. Perfect.
Yeah, Leonardo, if I may. No, you're right. I mean, in our case, for central banks and supervisors, we are not here to say, we don't want to be prescriptive in saying that particular kind of activities or that sector should be green or brown, because it's a political decision to be made. But what we need to know is to have a variety of shades, many shades of green and brown, from light green to dark brown. And it's very useful for us to have this continuum of colors, including also brown taxonomy, because so far in the EU, you have a so-called green taxonomy. But for us, if we want to do proper risk analysis, we also need to know what to measure. And currently there is no harmonized definition of what is non-green, if you like, what is brown. So we have to do the job ourselves by trying to guesstimate exactly what kind of sectors could be regarded as a non-green or brown. And so at the end of the day, the outcome of what we do is not consistent with what our colleagues are doing. So we certainly need something that is based on a continuum of colors. We also certainly need something that is dynamic. There are some sectors, there might be some sectors which are not green now, but over time, they will be greener. And ultimately, what we want to do is to prepare for the transition. So we want to help some sectors, some technologies, some activities to transition from where they are now to another place later. And to do that, we need to be able to measure, but also to reward, in a way, progress made towards a low carbon economy. So the second point is dynamic. And on the last question, you were asking about having a globally consistent taxonomy. Here, I mean, it seems to me, but it's a personal view, it seems to me quite difficult that one day we're going to have a harmonized global taxonomy, because you realize that at the end of the day, you have a lot of national specificities in the various taxonomies which are available right now. It reflects the variety of development. It reflects the variety of allocation of resources, of energy mix. So it makes sense in a way that we will not have a single taxonomy before a while. But it seems to me, but probably Leonardo can confirm that, we need to have clarity about what it's in there, what it's not in there. And investors need to know that when they invest in a green asset in a Y country, it's not the same green as in an X country. It's perfectly fine for them. Not all of them may be interested by, green assets in X country, but they need to know what they invest in, and they need to provide clarity vis-a-vis their end investors and say, look, we can invest in that particular kind of green assets in that country. It's green according to the local taxonomy. It's not green for us. Are you still interested to invest or not? And probably we could have a sort of progressive, iterative approach, starting by knowing what's in there and having something that is comparable and transparent. And later on, we can probably move towards maybe a two-tiers approach, whereby you would have a sort of a single core element of taxonomy, and on top of it, some specific regional or national blocks that you would put on top of it.
So if I just may add on what Morgan mentioned, and I basically agree with virtually everything that he said. And just to make sure, again, we're not policymakers, we are central, or in my case, development banks. And here in Brazil, we also separate what can be done locally and what we should try to have like a more global on a global basis. Locally, when we implement our ESG framework that we are planning to share with the market still this year, our goal is to be the model for all the Brazilian financial institutions. So at least here in Brazil, maybe even in South America in general, we want to be the model and set the tone in terms of what should be an ESG framework for the Brazilian economy. But on top of that, Morgan mentioned that is quite difficult, but I believe it is not impossible to have some basic rules that virtually works for all the global economy. And I believe that the development banks are working on that. So we have like the minimum set of what should be a ESG framework. We of course will need some adaptations for each and every country, but a international consensus, I believe it will be important. And it's not, and my personal opinion, and based on also on what I heard on discussions with the other development banks, I believe we're all aligned, and this is a goal that we can accomplish.
Sam, if I may just make a couple of practical observations. I mean, number one, I think looking at this from the perspective of nuclear, I think it's really important that the taxonomies have a common stance and a common supportive stance. So in our £20 billion project, it's only one project, but we're going to be tapping UK investors, European investors, US investors. And one way or another, they're going to get judged by their own taxonomies, and those will be an important reference point. And if nuclear has a red light or an amber light in any of these jurisdictions, that is going to have an adverse impact. I think that's the first point. I think the second point is, and I mean, it's really to sort of an amplification of the sorts of things that Morgan and Leonardo discuss. You know, these reporting issues look to be relatively innocuous. You could then say, well, yeah, but the standards that are set are higher than that. Yeah, but there's a much, much, much bigger effect, which is that the reporting is picked up through that wider stakeholder base. And we're finding that these institutional reputational issues are massive. They have a massive impact on the willingness of investors and lenders to participate enthusiastically in these projects. The magnification goes way, way beyond the objective requirements. It goes to, are we doing the right thing? What do our stakeholders think? And if I get close to the benchmarks, I fall behind the benchmarks, my employees get upset, my customers get upset, I get the black tag, the children of my employees don't like the fact that their parents work there, the prospective customers don't come. People just don't want to get the wrong side of those reputational situations, and that has a huge impact. And so the taxonomy, I think, it's by no means nominal. It's really important.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I saw Philippe nodding. I don't know, Philippe, whether you have anything to add to this.
No, it's perfectly well explained by Stephen. This reputation, of course, is not only about taxonomy, it's about everything. But something that can be hurt the reputation of a bank, a company, or is
massive. So it's not
only a regulatory aspect. I fully share Stephen's view. It goes beyond that. It goes also to other aspects like R&D. The European
Commission has announced that they would not finance R&D projects that would not be taxonomy compatible. So you have a kind of virtuous circle, or the opposite, that can be built up.
Exactly. No, I would agree with what you all have said. The analysis that we have done internally is exactly that even though these classifications may be regional or national, nowadays most investments are global. So you are going to have a mix of all kinds of nations. And as you brought up, I mean, the reputation, the appearance is going to be incredibly important, and that is going to drive support for some of these things. I don't know, Nicoletta, whether you wanted to add anything to this since you are the only one that didn't give you the opportunity to contribute to this.
Well, I have published a paper on the role of green finance in the greening agricultural sectors, and that's an area which, of course, is not the realm of this seminar panel. But these issues are very much at the heart. I think I say something which is in the public domain of the IMF, which is investing heavily in stress testing technologies and advising its membership about how to homogenize and improve and make more sophisticated the techniques of stress testing in the banking and financial sector. So these aspects are very important. I think maybe one thought I had in reaction to what was said is that a lot of this, taxonomies will have to be evolutive in the sense that, they will depend on where we stand relative to Paris and more generally relative to our objective of 1.5. And that will change as we approach, the end of the carbon budget that we have in front of us. So they will have to be revised, I think, almost year by year. And they will also be dependent to some extent with the price of carbon that we discussed, which is also evolving. It's growing as we approach the limits of planetary boundaries. That price, is going up and up and up. And so, that I think that will reflect to some extent in the view and the preferences of consumers and investors. And so it's a tricky business. I know that Mark Carney has spoken at the fund several times, including at our annual research conference, and he is working on a system to homogenize, the way carbon is priced through carbon voluntary markets. And I think this all wraps together. These are great initiatives, and I think they are fundamental efforts to bring home more investment, good investment, and the capital that is needed to make this energy transformation.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, that kind of brings me to my next question for perhaps all of you. And this may be, depending on how we do, maybe one of the last questions. So you just brought up that one of the campaign themes for the UK presidency for COP26, which of course will take place in Glasgow this November. We all hope that by then COVID will be out of the way and we will be able to get together. So as I was saying, one of the campaign themes is finance. And of course, COP26 President Alok Sharma and the Prime Minister's Finance Advisor for COP26, Mark Carney, sent a letter a few weeks ago to the CEOs of many global private financial institutions, urging them to sign up in what they call the race to zero, try to get ahead of COP26, trying to get all these global organizations setting very ambitious targets and action plans to reduce emissions and, of course, bring resiliency at the same time. So, what do you think will be the impact and maybe the success of this type of effort? And I will open it to all of you. I don't know who wants to jump first. I see Leonardo trying to open his camera.
Yes, no, I believe my personal view, this is a great effort. And I'll just briefly mention that sometimes we underestimate the importance of development banks and in terms of pioneering these sort of new strategies going forward. And I believe we development banks, we need to play an important role. We need to pioneer this movement, and I do believe that we are trying to work on it, and in the short term, we'll be able to help to put this agenda finally in place. Just a really short notice.
Very good. Stephen, I saw that you wanted to add something.
Yeah, look, I mean, it sort of builds on what I was saying, and I think what Leonardo has just said. Look, sometimes these initiatives can look to be a bit feeble because they don't have bite, they don't have teeth, but they are so directionally aligned with so much of society. I think they have real power. I think making public declarations of pathways that corporates are going to follow sets examples, it sets standards, it sets benchmarks, and then those that don't follow become called out. I think this momentum of financial and strategic declarations by corporates are actually far more powerful than people yet sometimes realize, and so I welcome them, and I think that they will have an effect because they draw attention to corporates who lag behind or who are not willing to step out and make these strategic commitments. And I think in that sense, it's a much more powerful initiative than people perhaps at first sight realize.
Yeah, very good point. I don't know if anybody, Philippe, Nicoletta, Morgan, want to add anything?
Yeah, just a few words. So we do work closely with the COP26 team on a number of common deliverables, and clearly they are ambitious, which is excellent for the central banks, but also for the private sector at large. For central banks, clearly what we would like to do is to promote a wider buy-in, of what we do, in terms of scenario analysis, disclosure, probably try to have more commitments from central banks to do a number of things. And maybe at one point I would like to raise, in response to what Leonardo mentioned, the role of development banks. I mean, it is a vital role, really, because private sector is ready to provide funding. This is what we see, but there is this problem of translating those available savings into, make it available to finance bankable or investable projects. And so there is this question of how you design, how you structure, or you de-risk some specific projects. And here, clearly, multilateral development banks have a role to play. And I'm pretty sure some of them are already working on the number of proposals that would be released at the COP26 in November.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So, Nicoletta,
I may just a few words. So, as the IMF managing director often reminds us, time is not our friend here, and I think any initiative that pushes ahead, creates momentum is welcome. And we have a list of, I think, beautiful deliverables ourselves as IMF for the, for the COP26, which I won't reveal, but you can find out on the website. And it really is a race. But as Steve was saying, it's almost, there's hope. I have hope that this is a non-linear process. When we're accustomed to policy lags, to time to build lags, I think a lot of chunks of humanity, people that have, a sense of reality, are scared, and they nest in their utility, that of their children, and maybe even those of their grandchildren, even if they don't have them. And this, when we align the finance, the consumer preferences, and the policymakers, which actually the policymakers may be lagging a little bit, but now it seems there's a critical mass of countries that have pledged. There's a critical group of corporates that have pledged. I think this is going to create an acceleration. That doesn't mean we can be complacent. We all have in our own, little or big sphere, push as hard as we can until things start to pivot. And that is our responsibility. It's our generation responsibility. So I take that very seriously. And I'm here today, not in my own capacity, but I think we're all here convinced of that. And that, I think, will work. We will make this work. Failure is not an option.
I really love that very positive message. I love that. So I think that I'm just going to stop at that. That is the message that I want to take for everybody. So I think we are a little bit over our time, so I will stop here. I truly think we have covered a number of very interesting approaches for cost-effective investment that will hopefully result in the biggest impacts as possible in terms of both decarbonization, economic revitalization, and also reaching the global sustainable development goals. Obviously, I certainly hope that nuclear energy projects will be able to secure affordable financing and thus deliver the positive contribution that I know it can to all these efforts. So let me stop here by thanking all our panelists for taking part in this conversation. I mean, at least to me, I've learned a lot. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. So thank you very much to all of you. And I will stop here. First of all, I want to thank Jurenco, which is the sponsor of this event. Thank you so much. And then I also, before I let you all go, I want to remind you of the next events that we have organized for World Nuclear University, or World Nuclear Association. Our next online event will be the World Nuclear Fuel Cycle Conference, which will be held virtually on 13-15 April. And you can find all the information in our website. And we will have our next World Nuclear Association Strategic eForum will be in June. And the topic of that particular one will be innovation in nuclear. Of course, the recording for today's panel will be posted very soon in our website at www.worldnuclearforum.com. And of course, while you are there and you can see the recording for today, you can also see some of the one-to-one interviews that we did with several experts trying to warm up to get ready for today's conversation. So with this, I will stop. I will thank everybody for joining us today, and I wish you a very, very pleasant rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you for attending the Strategic eForum on Sustainable Finance. Thank you again to our sponsors Jurenco, who are sponsoring this series. As was mentioned, if you'd like to see more of the videos, please go to worldnuclearforum.com, and we hope to see you at the World Nuclear Fuel Cycle Conference on the 13th to the 15th of April.